I never thought I would end up in a relationship with an alpha. For most of my life, I had avoided them. Too pushy, too overconfident, too convinced that they had some unspoken claim over omegas like me. I didn't want to be claimed. I didn't want to be possessed. So, when Rainer Eisen started showing up in my life, I thought he would be just like the rest. I was wrong. 3 months ago, I agreed to a date for the first time in years. It wasn't a grand gesture or a romantic affair. Just a simple evening at a small tavern, sitting across from a man who somehow made me feel safe instead of trapped. Rainer never demanded my time, never acted like he was entitled to me. He just showed up. And with time, I found that I didn't mind it. I still remember how he watched me that night, his sharp gaze steady, his usual smirk just a little softer. I wasn't sure if you actually liked me when we first started this, he had admitted, his voice calm, thoughtful. I had laughed, shaking my head. What gave you that idea? You avoided me for the first 2 weeks. He wasn't wrong. But back then I had been careful. Now I had let him in. 3 months had passed since that night. And somehow, without me realizing it, Rainer had become part of my life. It wasn't a dramatic, all-consuming love story. It was something quieter, steady, something I had started to rely on, which meant that when he showed up at my door early this morning, arms crossed, smirking like he had already won some unspoken argument, I knew I had no excuse to turn him away. We're going out, he announced. I sighed, already reaching for my cloak. Out where? He shrugged. Anywhere. And despite my grumbling and protests, I followed him outside, because this was us now. And maybe I didn't mind that at all. It had been 2 days since my outing with Rainer, and things had settled back into their usual routine. Or so I thought, because, as I was preparing to leave for work, there was a knock at my door. A sharp, deliberate knock that didn't sound like Rainer's usual impatient one. I hesitated before opening it, and standing there, to my absolute horror, was an older alpha couple, dressed in fine travel-worn cloaks, their sharp gazes sweeping over me with quiet intensity. I didn't need to ask who they were. I already knew. Rainer's parents. I blinked, gripping the doorframe. Can I help you? The woman, tall, regal, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, gave me a polite but assessing look. You must be Andreas. Beside her, the man, broader, more serious, with a military-like posture, studied me with an unreadable expression. We've heard much about you, he said. I resisted the urge to glance behind me, half expecting Rainer to jump out and explain why his alpha parents were currently standing at my doorstep unannounced. Rainer isn't here. His mother smiled sharp, knowing. We're aware. We came to see you. I felt my stomach drop. Me? Why? This had all the makings of a very long morning. I didn't have a choice but to let them inside. As I poured them tea, Rainer's mother, Elise Eisen, took in my small but tidy home with a keen eye. This is rather modest. I stiffened slightly. I like it. She nodded. Simple living isn't a bad thing. Meanwhile, Rainer's father, Marcus Eisen, a beta who carried himself like an alpha, studied me with an expression that gave nothing away. You work at the trade hall, don't you? He finally asked. I swallowed a sip of tea before answering. Yes. And you're an omega. I knew where this was going. Yes. Elise and Marcus exchanged a glance. Here we go. Rainer is an alpha. Elise's voice was calm, measured. A strong one. He could lead a pack if he wished. I raised an eyebrow. He has no interest in that. Marcus nodded. Yes, but he still carries his lineage. And an alpha of his standing choosing an omega who... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Who does not follow traditional roles. It is unexpected. I set my cup down with deliberate slowness. If you came here to tell me that I'm not a proper omega for him, you're wasting your time. Elise let out a soft laugh. Oh, you're bold. I can see why he likes you. That threw me off. Marcus smirked slightly. Rainer has always been stubborn. We don't intend to change his mind. I frowned. Then why are you here? Elise tilted her head. We wanted to see for ourselves. I crossed my arms. And? What's your verdict? Marcus regarded me for a long moment. Then, to my complete surprise, he nodded in approval. You'll do. I nearly choked on my tea. As if sensing my suffering, the door swung open, and in walked Reiner looking winded, like he had just run across town. His eyes immediately landed on his parents. You didn't. Elise smiled far too innocently. We did. Reiner groaned, running a hand down his face before turning to me. Are you okay? I stared at him. I think your father just gave me his blessing. Reiner froze. Then he turned to Marcus, horrified. You didn't. Marcus shrugged. I did. Reiner looked back at me. You survived. I sipped my tea, voice dry. Barely. Elise chuckled. We'll leave you two to it. Marcus gave me one last nod before heading toward the door with his mate. We'll see you again, Andreas. I wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. And just like that, they were gone. The second the door shut, I turned to Reiner. What the hell was that? Reiner groaned. I was hoping to warn you first. I gaped at him. You knew they were coming? Not this early. He ran a hand through his hair. I told them to give it time. I narrowed my eyes. And instead, they showed up at my door before breakfast. He sighed. Yeah. I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temples. So let me get this straight. Your alpha mother and beta father showed up, tested me like I was livestock, and then left me with a you'll do, as if I just passed some ridiculous challenge. Reiner grimaced. Yeah. I stared at him. This is your fault. His lips twitched. I can make it up to you. I grabbed the nearest piece of bread and threw it at his head. He definitely deserved that. Reiner caught the piece of bread before it could hit him, giving me a deeply amused look. That was uncalled for, he said. I crossed my arms. No, what was uncalled for was your parents ambushing me first thing in the morning. He had the audacity to smirk. You handled it well. I groaned and flopped onto a chair. I shouldn't have had to handle it at all. Reiner walked over, leaning against the table, arms crossed. For what it's worth, they wouldn't have come if they didn't think I was serious about you. I blinked at him, caught off guard. Serious? He nodded, watching me carefully. Yeah, they wanted to see who had caught my attention for this long. My mother's way of checking if you're worthy. My father's way of making sure I'm not making a mistake. I scoffed. And what if they thought I was a mistake? Reiner's eyes darkened slightly. Wouldn't have changed a thing. I opened my mouth, then closed it. There it was again. That quiet, steady certainty that came so easily to him. Like nothing and no one could shake the way he felt about me. I cleared my throat, suddenly feeling too warm. Well, I still hate you for this. Reiner chuckled. That's fair. After spending far too long ranting about the day's events, I finally started to relax. Reiner, annoyingly, looked completely unbothered, stretched out in my chair like he belonged there. You're not staying here, I muttered, standing up. He raised an eyebrow. Says who? Says me. I walked toward my room, rubbing my face. I need peace, and sleep, and a day where no Eisen alphas or betas show up at my door. I can offer 2 out of 3. I sighed. Reiner. He smirked but stood anyway. All right. I'll leave you in peace. As I opened my bedroom door, I heard him say, far too smugly, good night, Andreas. Sleep well, future son-in-law. I threw a pillow at his head and slammed the door shut. I was never living this down. After the ordeal with Reiner's parents, I had hoped for at least a few days of peace. That hope lasted exactly one afternoon. Because as I was finishing my work at the trade hall, Lucas burst in unannounced, looking far too excited for my liking. We're going to the festival. I didn't look up from my ledger. No, we're not. Yes, we are. I sighed. Lucas. No excuses, Andreas. It's the first festival of the season, and you're coming. I frowned. You know how festivals are for omegas. Lucas rolled his eyes. Oh, please. It's not like they're gonna throw you onto a claiming stage. It's just food, music, and dancing, and alphas, and betas, and other omegas. An actual fun which you desperately need. I gave him a flat look. Still no. Before he could argue, a familiar voice cut in. What's this about a festival? I tensed immediately. Lucas grinned. Perfect timing. Reiner, convince Andreas to come. I turned slowly to see Reiner leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking highly interested in this conversation. I glared at Lucas. You're the worst. Lucas winked. You love me. I did not love him at this moment. I grabbed my things, ignoring Reiner's amused stare as I exited the trade hall. Unfortunately, he followed. So, you don't like festivals? I don't like the attention. Reiner hummed. I can see that. I shot him a look. Then you understand why I'm not going. No, I understand why you don't want to go. He smirked. Different things. I groaned. Let me guess. You think I should go? I think it'd be fun. I raised an eyebrow. You? Fun? Since when? He chuckled. I make exceptions. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I hate both you and Lucas. Reiner's smirk widened. So I'll pick you up at sunset? I glared. Fine. I had a very bad feeling about this. Sunset came too quickly. Despite my best efforts to mentally prepare, I still found myself reluctantly adjusting my cloak as I waited outside my cottage. The festival lights had already begun to glow in the distance, casting a warm shimmer over the village. Laughter and the lively sounds of music and dancing carried through the cool evening air. I shouldn't have agreed to this. You look like you're considering running. I turned to see Reiner, standing far too comfortably with his usual lazy smirk. He had dressed slightly better than usual, a dark tunic with a leather vest, his hair just neat enough to suggest effort, but not too much. Typical. I crossed my arms. Would you stop me? Absolutely. Of course he would. Reiner tilted his head toward the festival. Come on. Lucas is probably already drunk. I sighed and followed. The market square had been completely transformed. Colorful banners hung between the buildings, and lanterns glowed in soft amber hues, lighting the cobbled streets. Stalls overflowed with food, trinkets, and handmade crafts, while performers played lively tunes on flutes and stringed instruments. People were everywhere. Betas and omegas laughing, alphas showing off in front of potential mates, children running between stalls. I kept close to Reiner's side, instinctively aware of how many alphas were in the crowd. Even though society had changed, festivals still held old traditions, and some alphas still saw unbonded omegas as fair game. Reiner must have noticed my hesitation because he leaned down slightly. You're safe, Andreas. I huffed. I know that. Then relax. Easier said than done. We found Lucas near a stall, already munching on a honeyed pastry. You came, he said between bites. I shot him a pointed look. Against my better judgment. Lucas grinned, completely unrepentant. You'll thank me later. I highly doubted that. Reiner, meanwhile, had already wandered over to a nearby stall selling roasted meat and ale. He handed me a skewer of spiced lamb without asking. I raised an eyebrow. So now you're just deciding my meals? You like this? Damn him. He was right. I took a bite, ignoring his victorious smirk. Things were going fine until they weren't. I had separated from Reiner and Lucas briefly to check out a stall selling handwoven scarves. When I felt it, a lingering stare. I turned slightly, immediately recognizing the alpha watching me. Tall, broad, unfamiliar. I could already guess what he was thinking. Before I could decide whether to ignore him or leave, he made the decision for me. You here alone, Omega? I clenched my jaw. Here we go. No, I didn't even bother looking at him. You sure? Haven't seen you with anyone. I turned, giving him a flat look. I'm sure. The alpha grinned, clearly not getting the hint. Before he could say anything else, a hand landed on my shoulder, warm, familiar. Reiner. His presence was immediate, solid, cutting through the tension like a blade. Is there a problem? He asked, his tone light, but edged with something else. The other alpha hesitated. Good. He should. Just making conversation. Reiner smiled sharp, unfriendly. Then we're done talking. The alpha lingered for half a second too long, then finally backed off, disappearing into the crowd. I exhaled slowly. Reiner didn't say anything at first. Then, "You okay?" I glanced at him. His sharp gaze hadn't left me. I sighed. "Yeah, just expected that to happen at some point." His jaw tightened slightly. "He shouldn't have approached you." "It's fine, Reiner." His expression told me he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. Instead, he nudged my shoulder lightly. "Come on. We're not letting him ruin the night." Later in the evening, as the music swelled, couples and groups gathered in the open square to dance. Lucas was already twirling some poor beta around, grinning wildly. I, on the other hand, had zero intention of joining, which is why I was immediately suspicious when Reiner turned to me. "Dance with me." I almost choked. "Excuse me? Dance. You know, moving your feet to music." I gave him a deadpan look. "I know what dancing is." "Then what's the problem?" I gestured to myself. "I don't dance." Reiner smirked. "I think you do." "No." He tilted his head, studying me. Then, instead of asking again, he simply held out his hand. I stared at it. His expression was calm, patient, certain, just like the way he had always been with me. I sighed. "Fine." I took his hand. Dancing with Reiner was easy. His grip was steady, unhurried, leading me through the steps without pressure or expectation. The festival noise faded slightly, replaced by the warmth of his presence and the flickering glow of lantern light around us. For once, I didn't think about the people watching, about what it meant, about what would come next. I just let it happen. And for the first time all evening, I actually enjoyed myself. The festival had begun to wind down, the music softening as people gradually dispersed. Stalls closed, lanterns flickered, and the once bustling square grew quieter. Lucas had long since disappeared, no doubt off with some beta he had charmed over the course of the night. I barely noticed. I was too focused on the warmth of Reiner's hand still resting lightly on my wrist. Neither of us had said much since the dance, but the silence was comfortable. Until Reiner finally spoke. "Ready to head home?" I exhaled, nodding. "Yeah." The streets were nearly empty, the glow of distant lanterns casting long shadows on the cobblestone paths. The air had cooled, carrying the lingering scent of burnt wood, spiced cider, and crushed flower petals left behind from the festival. Reiner walked beside me, steps unhurried, his usual easy confidence making it seem as if we had all the time in the world. "So?" he said after a moment. I glanced at him. "So what?" He smirked. "Did you hate it?" I rolled my eyes. "No, I didn't hate it. That almost sounds like a compliment." I sighed. "Fine. It was nice." He raised an eyebrow. "Just nice." "Reiner." He chuckled but didn't push further. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being our footsteps against the stone and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. For once, I didn't mind. By the time we reached my cottage, the village was completely still, only the occasional flicker of candlelight visible through distant windows. I stopped at my door, turning to face him. Reiner studied me, expression unreadable, but there was something quietly expectant in his gaze. I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say, but before I could come up with something, he smirked. "You should let me take you out more often." I scoffed. "One festival doesn't mean I've changed." "Didn't say you changed." He leaned slightly against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Just saying, you enjoyed tonight more than you thought you would." I sighed. "Maybe." His smirk widened, and I could already see his next smug remark forming. Before he could say it, I reached for the door handle. "Good night, Reiner." "Good night, Andreas." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me before he could make this moment any more insufferable. Leaning against the wood, I let out a slow breath. I had a good time, and I hated that he was right about it. The first snow of the season arrived unexpectedly. I had been in the trade hall, going through an endless stack of inventory reports, when Lucas burst in unannounced, his coat dusted with white. Andreas, it's snowing. I barely glanced up. Yes, Lucas. That tends to happen in winter. He ignored my sarcasm, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. Come outside. You've been locked in here all day. Unlike some people, I have work. Lucas dragged me outside anyway. The town square had been transformed. Snow dusted the rooftops, blanketed the cobblestone streets, and softened the sharp edges of the world. Children ran past, laughing as they tossed handfuls of snow at each other, while merchants shook out their canopies, grumbling about the sudden cold. I exhaled, watching my breath curl in the air. It was peaceful. See, Lucas grinned. Better than paperwork. I hate that you're right. Before he could gloat, a familiar voice interrupted. You look like you're plotting something. I turned to see Reiner, standing at the edge of the square, arms crossed, his usual amused expression in place. Snowflakes had caught in his dark hair, making him look just a little less like the intimidating alpha he pretended to be. Lucas smirked. I was just trying to get Andreas to enjoy himself for once. Reiner's gaze flicked to me. And? Is it working? I sighed. Debatable. Reiner chuckled. We'll see about that. Before I could react, he reached down, scooped up a handful of snow, and threw it directly at me. The cold hit my cheek, shocking me for half a second before pure outrage set in. Reiner. He looked entirely too pleased with himself. Yes. Lucas, not helping at all, burst into laughter. I bent down, grabbed a perfectly packed snowball, and threw it at full force. Reiner dodged barely, his smirk widening. Oh, you're in trouble now. Before I could escape, he was already moving. Another snowball flying toward me. Lucas, the traitor, immediately switched sides. Get him! And just like that, all hell broke loose. Snow flew in every direction as we chased each other through the square, slipping on the icy ground, dodging between startled merchants, and ignoring the judgmental looks of passing betas and alphas. At one point, I managed to land a snowball directly against Reiner's chest, which I counted as a victory, until he tackled me into a snowbank moments later. I sputtered, half buried, while he loomed over me, looking entirely too satisfied. Surrender? He asked. I glared at him. Never. He smirked. Then you leave me no choice. I barely had time to process what he meant before he reached out and shoved a handful of snow down the back of my coat. Reiner! His laughter echoed through the square as I shoved him off and bolted for revenge. By the time we finally called a truce, we were soaked and freezing, our clothes clinging with melted snow. Lucas had fled inside a tavern long ago, abandoning me to Reiner's unfair advantage in height and strength. Come on, Reiner said, nudging me toward a nearby inn. Let's get warm before you freeze to death. I grumbled under my breath but followed. Inside, the heat from the fireplace was immediate and welcoming. I peeled off my wet cloak, rubbing my hands together as I sank into a chair. Reiner reappeared with 2 steaming cups of cider, setting one in front of me before taking the seat across from mine. I eyed him suspiciously. I'm not thanking you. For what? He smirked over his cup. Winning. I kicked him under the table. He chuckled but didn't protest the warmth of my foot staying against his under the table. We sat there, cider in hand, the fire crackling beside us, snow falling outside. And for once, I didn't mind the winter at all. The warmth of the fireplace had settled into my bones, but it did nothing to quiet the way Reiner watched me from across the table. It wasn't the usual smirk or his teasing amusement. It was heavier, quieter, certain. I should have looked away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself holding his gaze, the flickering light casting shadows over the sharp angles of his face. There was something undeniable between us, something we had been dancing around for far too long. And tonight, I didn't feel like avoiding it. By the time we left the inn, the village was almost silent, the snowfall having softened the world into a hush of white and distant lantern light. Reiner walked beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, his presence steady as ever. I should have felt self-conscious. Instead, I felt safe, comfortable, and when we finally reached my cottage, I hesitated at the door. Not because I wanted him to leave, but because I wasn't ready for him to go. I turned slowly, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Stay. Reiner's eyes darkened slightly. Are you sure? I nodded, heart hammering. Yes. He didn't need more than that. He stepped forward, closing the space between us in one slow, deliberate motion, his fingers brushing my jaw, tilting my face up toward his. And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was certain, like he had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. And this time I let it happen. I woke up before dawn, the room still dark and quiet, the lingering warmth of Reiner beside me keeping away the morning chill. I hadn't expected to feel so at peace. I shifted slightly, turning to face him. He was already awake, watching me with that unreadable expression. I raised an eyebrow. You staring at me now? He smirked. It's a good view. I huffed, shoving his shoulder. Shut up. Reiner caught my hand before I could pull away, his grip firm, steady. And then, before I could process what was happening, he exhaled, a small, almost nervous breath and said, "Marry me." My brain short-circuited. What? His expression didn't waver. Marry me. I stared at him, completely caught off guard. Reiner, I stopped, tried to think, tried to breathe. But the more I looked at him, the certainty in his gaze, the quiet, unwavering patience in the way he waited for my answer, the more I realized something. I already knew my answer. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around his. And then, finally, I nodded. Yes. The day had arrived faster than I expected. One moment, I was saying yes in the quiet of my cottage, and the next, I was standing in front of a gathering of friends, family, and far too many people for my liking, preparing to bond myself to Reiner Eisen. As an Omega, marriage was always seen as something inevitable, a future written for me long before I had a say in it. But this was my choice. And somehow that made all the difference. The town square had been transformed. Garlands of winter flowers were woven between wooden beams, and soft lanterns glowed in the crisp evening air. The scent of spiced cider and freshly baked bread drifted from the feast tables, where guests, betas, alphas, and omegas alike, chatted and laughed, waiting for the ceremony to begin. I stood in the small stone courtyard near the center, adjusting the dark blue cloak draped over my shoulders, trying to settle my nerves. Lucas, standing beside me, grinned. Still thinking of running? I glared at him. Not funny. I think it's hilarious. Before I could murder him, a voice called out. Deep, confident, and far too familiar. You're not running, are you? I turned, heart jumping despite myself. Reiner. He looked different. Not in the way he was dressed. A deep charcoal tunic with silver embroidery, a leather belt fastened around his waist. His hair combed back just enough to be considered formal, but still messy enough to be him. But there was something in his eyes, something steadier than ever, something that made my breath catch in my throat. He was ready for this, and I realized, standing there in front of him, so was I. The ceremony was simple, traditional. An elder presiding, speaking of bonding, partnership, and the future we were choosing together. I barely heard the words. I was too focused on Reiner, on the way he stood, unwavering, on the way his thumb brushed over my wrist when he took my hand, on the way his lips curled into the faintest smile when I squeezed his fingers in return. And when it was time to speak our vows, I swallowed, meeting his gaze, and said, I choose you. Nothing overly poetic, nothing flowery, just the truth. Reiner exhaled, smirking just slightly before responding in kind. And I choose you. The elder placed a ceremonial ribbon over our joined hands, binding us in the eyes of the clans, our people, and the traditions that had existed long before us. And just like that, it was done. I was his, and he was mine. The night was a blur of laughter, food, and far too many well-wishers slapping me on the back. Lucas, of course, had drunk himself into a dramatic mess. Elena and Mathis challenged each other to a drinking contest. Even Reiner's parents, who had once scrutinized me like a merchant assessing trade goods, seemed genuinely pleased. But the only moment I truly cared about came much later. The cottage was quiet when we finally stepped inside, the echoes of celebration still distant in the village square. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. That was exhausting. Reiner, standing near the door, smirked. You survived. Barely. I turned to face him, and for the first time all evening, I allowed myself to really take it in. The way he stood, relaxed yet waiting. The way the firelight cast soft shadows across his face. The way the weight of the day settled between us. Not as something overwhelming, but as something steady. Something certain. His voice was softer when he spoke. Are you happy? I didn't even have to think about it. I stepped closer, resting my forehead against his. Yeah. His hands found my waist, pulling me against him. Good. And then he kissed me. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just right. Just ours. And for the first time in my life, I had nothing to run from. I woke up to the warmth of Reiner's arm draped over my waist and the soft glow of morning light filtering through the window. For a few moments, I just lay there, listening to the quiet. It was strange. Waking up next to someone, knowing that this wasn't temporary. That this was forever. And somehow, that thought didn't scare me as much as it once might have. I turned slightly, only to find Reiner already awake, watching me with that unreadable expression of his. I groaned. You're staring again. You're my husband now. I'm allowed. I buried my face in my pillow. I take it back. Divorce. Reiner chuckled and tightened his hold, pulling me closer. Too late. I sighed dramatically but didn't pull away. Marriage didn't suddenly change everything overnight. I still went to work at the trade hall, still dealt with paperwork and merchants who thought an Omega couldn't possibly know more about trade than they did. Reiner still patrolled with the town guards, still somehow managed to show up at the worst possible times to steal my lunch. But there were small differences, like the way his hand would find mine under the table when we ate dinner together. The way I no longer had to sleep alone in a too-quiet cottage. The way he'd pull me against him in the mornings before I could escape the bed, muttering something about how I was too warm to let go. Of course, living together wasn't without its challenges. I quickly discovered that Reiner was terrible at putting things back where they belonged. Where's the ink bottle? I muttered one evening, shuffling through my desk. Silence. I turned. Reiner was sitting at the table, looking entirely too innocent. I narrowed my eyes. Reiner. He cleared his throat. What ink bottle? I sighed and checked his hands. Sure enough, faint smudges of black ink. I crossed my arms. You used it, didn't you? Maybe. I groaned. Where is it? Reiner glanced toward the bookshelf. I followed his gaze. Sure enough, my ink bottle was there, on the highest shelf. I stared at it, then at him. Why? He smirked. Seemed like a good place. I threw a pillow at his head. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And before I knew it, our life together no longer felt like something new. Felt like home. It wasn't perfect. We still argued over ridiculous things. Still teased and pushed each other's patience. Still had moments where we needed space. But at the end of the day, he was there. And I was exactly where I wanted to be. Life with Reiner had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings spent bickering over breakfast, days filled with work and stolen moments together, and nights where he held me close, like he still couldn't believe I was his. It was steady, familiar hours. But then something changed, and it started with me feeling off. I first noticed it when I lost my appetite. Reiner had brought home fresh bread and spiced meat from the market, a meal I usually enjoyed, but the moment I took a bite, my stomach twisted uncomfortably. I pushed the plate away. Reiner frowned. Not hungry. I shook my head, trying to ignore the strange nausea creeping up my throat. Just tired. That wasn't a lie. I had been tired a lot lately, more than usual. And then, a few days later, Lucas stopped by. We were sitting in my kitchen when he suddenly paused mid-sentence, narrowed his eyes at me, and said, Andreas, when was your last heat? I froze. The realization hit me so fast that I nearly dropped my cup of tea. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a fog, my mind racing through every possibility, every doubt, every emotion I wasn't ready to process yet. By the time Reiner came home, I still hadn't figured out how to bring it up. So naturally, I blurted it out. I think I'm pregnant. Reiner, halfway through removing his cloak, froze. For the first time in our entire relationship, I saw him completely speechless. He blinked. You, what? I swallowed, suddenly feeling nervous. I'm not sure, but I think I am. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long, excruciating pause, he exhaled, not in panic, but in something almost like disbelief. And then he smiled, a real smile, a smile that made my heart stumble in my chest. We're having a pup? His voice was quiet, reverent, like he was still trying to process the words. I let out a small, breathless laugh. It seems that way. And then, before I could say anything else, he crossed the space between us and pulled me into his arms, holding me like I was the most precious thing in the world, like this was the best thing that had ever happened to him. For a long moment, we just stood there, wrapped up in each other, the weight of this new reality sinking in. Then Reiner pulled back just enough to press his forehead against mine. Are you happy? He asked softly. I thought about it. About the fears, the unknowns, the way our lives were about to change forever. And then I thought about him. His steady presence, his unwavering certainty, the way he had always been my safe place. I let out a breath and smiled. Yeah. His grip tightened just slightly. Good. And just like that, our life together shifted into something even bigger. Something new. Something ours. The realization that I was pregnant changed everything. Not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that made everything feel different, sharper, more real. Reiner, of course, handled it like he handled everything else in life. Steady, certain, completely unfazed. Me? I was still adjusting. The next morning, I told Lucas. He screamed, loudly. You're what? I winced. Lucas, I'm right here. He grabbed my shoulders. You're going to have a pup. A tiny, adorable version of you. Wait, no, it might look like Reiner. That's less exciting. I sighed. Thank you for that. Does Reiner know? I nodded. Told him last night. Lucas squinted at me. And? What did he do? Did he panic? Faint? Fall dramatically to his knees? I snorted. No. He smiled and hugged me. Lucas groaned. Of course he did. Typical alpha reaction. Couldn't even give me a dramatic response. I had expected Reiner to be supportive. I had not expected him to turn into a protective menace. Started small. He insisted on carrying everything for me, even things I was perfectly capable of lifting. Reiner, I can carry a bag of apples. No, he takes it anyway. Then he started watching me too closely, like I might suddenly collapse if I walked too far. And when I tripped, over absolutely nothing, mind you, he nearly lost his mind. That's it. I'm carrying you. Reiner, no. He picked me up anyway. I smacked his shoulder. Put me down, you overgrown wolf. No. Despite his overprotectiveness, I couldn't deny that Reiner was excited. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, he reached for my hand. What do you want our pup's life to be like? I hesitated, thinking. Safe, happy, free to choose their own future. Reiner nodded, eyes thoughtful. I want that too. I squeezed his fingers. And I want them to have a father like you. His breath hitched just slightly, his grip on my hand tightening. You really think that? I smiled, leaning into him. Yeah. He exhaled slowly, pressing a kiss to my temple. Then we'll make sure of it. And in that moment, with the fire flickering beside us and his hand warm in mine, I knew we were ready. By the time I was 6 months pregnant, life had settled into a rhythm, one that felt almost too perfect. Reiner was always there, his hands constantly resting over my growing stomach, murmuring about how strong our pup would be. I had started to believe we had all the time in the world. But then everything changed. It started with a fever. A small thing at first, something easily ignored, something that Reiner brushed off. It's just the cold, he had said. I'll be fine in a few days. But the days passed, and he didn't get better. His fever worsened. His strength faded. And before I knew it, the strongest alpha I had ever known was struggling to stand. I brought healers, as many as I could find. Betas, omegas, even an alpha healer who specialized in illnesses of the blood. None of them had answers. None of them could save him. I sat by his side, gripping his too warm hand, watching as the man who had once carried me through a snowstorm without breaking a sweat now struggled to lift a cup of water. It wasn't fair. One night, as I sat beside him, he turned his weakening gaze toward me. Andreas. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it before. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You should rest. He exhaled a shaky breath, his fingers brushing over my stomach, where our pups still kicked and moved, oblivious to the fact that their father was dying. I won't be here to meet them. I shook my head immediately. Don't say that. I need you to listen. I gritted my teeth, fighting the burning behind my eyes. I don't want to. He gave me the smallest, faintest smile. Stubborn Omega. I let out a shaky breath, gripping his hand tighter. I want you to name them, he said. Something strong. Something that will remind them of who they are. I forced myself to breathe. Tell me. His fingers tightened slightly around mine. Ren. Simple. Solid. Part of him. I swallowed past the grief rising in my throat and nodded. Ren. His smile softened, his eyes growing heavier. Take care of them. My breath shook. I will. His thumb brushed my wrist, the way it always did. And then he was gone. The house felt too quiet without him. His presence had always been so strong, so steady, that without him, I felt like the world had been tilted off its axis. But I wasn't alone. Not completely. Because Run was still with me. Piece of him. A reminder. Promise. And so, even with the grief crushing my chest, I did the only thing I could. I kept moving forward. Life after Reiner felt like walking through a world that had lost its color. The house was too quiet. The bed was too empty. The weight of his absence pressed down on me in ways I couldn't explain. A silence where his voice should have been. An emptiness where his warmth used to be. But I kept going. Because I had to. Because Ren still needed me. My pregnancy continued, and I marked the days alone. No one said it, but I knew people were watching me carefully. Lucas, Elena, even Reiner's parents. They hovered at the edges of my grief, never forcing me to talk, but always there. Lucas took it upon himself to make sure I was eating. Elise, Reiner's mother, quietly sent supplies, fabrics for baby clothes, herbs for strength. Even Marcus, who had always been a stoic, unreadable beta, placed a hand on my shoulder one day and simply said, "He would be proud of you." And maybe that was true, but I still wished he was here to see it himself. It happened late at night. A sharp pain in my abdomen pulled me out of sleep, followed by a wave of pressure so strong it stole my breath. First, I thought it was nothing. Then the second wave hit, and I knew. Ren was coming. Everything after that was a blur of movement and pain. Lucas was the first to arrive, eyes wide with panic as he rushed to get the healer. Elise came soon after, her usually composed demeanor cracking as she knelt beside me, her hands steady, guiding. I barely registered the voices around me. All I could think about was Reiner, how he should have been here, holding my hand, whispering reassurances in my ear, telling me I was strong. Instead, I had to be strong alone, and so I fought through it. I breathed through the pain, I pushed forward, and finally, a cry filled the room, high and piercing and alive. A healer placed a tiny, wriggling bundle into my arms, and for the first time in months, the weight in my chest lifted. Ren was here, tiny, warm, his little fists clenched tightly, his soft cries easing into quiet, steady breaths as I held him close. Tears blurred my vision, and I pressed my forehead against his, whispering the only thing that mattered. "I've got you." And for the first time since Reiner left, I felt like I wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before I knew it, a year had passed. Ren grew stronger every day, his small hands gripping my fingers, his bright eyes always filled with curiosity. He had Reiner's smirk, just a little one. But it was there. And sometimes, when he looked at me, I swore I saw the same unwavering certainty his father had carried. He was my reason to keep going. And so I did. Ren took his first steps on a quiet afternoon. Lucas had been visiting, teasing me about how my son would probably run before he walked, and then, just like that, Ren pulled himself up and stumbled forward, straight into my arms. I had never cried over something so simple before, but it wasn't simple at all. It was proof that life kept moving, that even though I had lost so much, I had also gained something just as precious. The graveyard was quiet when I arrived, the wind rustling through the tall grass. Ren, now able to walk with confidence, toddled beside me, his small fingers gripping mine. He didn't understand why we were here, but I did. I knelt before the stone marker, running my fingers over the carved letters of Reiner's name. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then softly, I whispered, "He's here." Ren, sensing my quiet mood, tilted his head up at me, his wide eyes so much like his father's. "Papa?" he babbled, the word still new on his tongue. I swallowed, brushing a hand through his hair. "Yeah, pup, this is your papa." The wind stirred the leaves, and I closed my eyes for just a moment, imagining that if I listened hard enough, I could still hear Reiner's voice in the breeze. "You're doing good, Andreas," I exhaled, and when I opened my eyes, I smiled, because for the first time since he was gone, I truly believed it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any new content.